Hi there, my name is Lindsay. I'm from Toodlelou and I am delighted to be bringing you this workshop called Bees, Biodiversity and Me. We are going to be talking about the brilliant little insect that is the bee, why it's so important, all of the incredible work that it does for us, why it's a little bit in trouble at the moment and could use our help, and lots of the simple things that we can do, you and I, our parents, our schools, our communities, to help the bee in order to have a healthy environment. And included in this workshop, I'm going to show you step by step how you can build a home for a bee hotel. It's going to look a little bit like this. So before we begin building our bee hotel, let's learn a little bit about bees and why it is that they're so very important. This workshop is called Bees, Biodiversity and Me. So let's talk about that middle word, biodiversity, and what it could mean. You might have some guesses. Perhaps your teacher might want to hit pause on the video now and see if some of you would like to guess just what that word could mean. So, if you've taken a guess, let's see if you're correct. Biodiversity is actually two words brought together. Bio refers to life or biology, biological sciences. It refers to all of the living things on the planet. And diversity is another word for variety or a large number of different types of something. In this case, many different types of living things. So biodiversity brought together refers to the huge variety of life on our planet. It's incredibly important that we maintain healthy biodiversity on the planet so that all species of living things can continue thriving and living well. And in order to do that, there are some really important steps that we need to take. We need to respect the role of all living things in our biodiversity. So everything from soil and clean air to water and insects, right up to larger living things like mammals and ourselves, human beings. We all have a part to play in something that's an awful lot like a puzzle. Biodiversity requires all of those different components to work in harmony and to balance each other out in order to have a healthy planet, a healthy ecosystem. And bees, even though they're really tiny little insect, play an incredibly important role in biodiversity because they have a very important job. They are pollinators. So what's a pollinator, you might want to know? Let's start with the word pollination. So pollination is what happens when pollen is moved from one flower to another. And pollen is like a dust, and it's inside flowers, right at the very center of a flower. Flowers need pollen in order to make new seeds so that new flowers can grow. And in order for a flower to make a seed, they need to transfer pollen from one flower to another flower nearby. Now, if flowers had the ability to move, they might be able to do this by themselves, but most flowers need something else to transfer pollen from one flower to another, and that is where bees come in. You might have noticed when you've spotted a bee outside that they have rather fuzzy little bodies. The fuzzy hairs on their body are absolutely perfect for transferring pollen from one flower to another. As when a bee goes into the center of a flower, either to gather pollen or to drink from its nectar, that pollen can get trapped in the hairs on the fuzzy bee's body. Then when he moves to the next flower for a bit more food, some of the pollen from one flower falls into the other flower, transferring the pollen from one flower to another so that it can form new seeds and new flowers can grow. And because nature is so incredibly clever, those flowers that need the help of a pollinator to transfer their pollen are usually very brightly colored or smell incredibly sweet. so that they attract bees to them in order to help pollinate. When bees go searching for pollen, it's actually not just for them to eat. They're also feeding their babies, as baby bees rely on pollen and pollen alone as the only type of food that they eat at the beginning of their lives. So when a baby bee is born, mums and dads are incredibly busy buzzing about the garden, gathering up pollen to make sure their baby has enough food to eat. And they have a really incredible way of doing this. So while some of the pollen might get trapped on the fuzzy hairs on the bee's body, bees also do this in order to gather food. And I certainly hope that none of you do this when you're eating dinner at the kitchen table. They spit on their front feet and gather up pollen into a kind of ball. They roll it up with their wet front feet. And then, because they're so very clever, they transfer that sticky ball of pollen back to their hind legs, or to the feet at the backs of their bodies, where they can hold it behind them while they fly back to the nest or the hive to give the ball of sticky pollen to their baby to feed. What a strange way of gathering food. But really, really interesting, if you ask me. So gathering up all of that pollen in order to feed their babies is hard work for bees. And in order to have the energy to keep on working all day long, buzzing about the garden and gathering pollen, they need something to give them energy, and they get it from nectar. The nectar is in the flowers. So when bees go to a flower, they feed on the nectar, and then they gather the pollen to bring it back to their babies. So as bees travel around our gardens, feeding from the nectar of flowers, which is like a really sweet sugary syrup, and gathering pollen to bring back to their babies, they are transferring pollen from one flower to another, either dropping a little bit from that sticky ball of pollen that they're carrying in their feet, or by a little bit of it falling off the hairs of their body and transferring it from one flower to another so that the flower can be pollinated, grow seeds, and new flowers can be born. Sounds like an important job, but let's talk about the reasons why pollination is so incredibly important to biodiversity. So we know that pollination is very important in order for new seeds to be grown by a flower in order to make new flowers. But those flowers then grow into plants, and a huge number of the plants that are pollinated by bees are food sources for us humans. Things like strawberries, apples, pears, pumpkins, which are really fun to carve at Halloween, but they're also a really nutritious form of food. Beans, blackberries, there's a huge big list of plants that we rely on for food that rely on bees to be pollinated. So, by going around our gardens and our fields and our wild spaces, pollinating plants, bees are helping to ensure that we have a broad diversity of crops or food to eat, which keeps us healthy and growing. In addition to pollinating plants so that we have healthy food to eat, bees also help other living things and other people. Farmers in particular rely very heavily on the help of bees in order to pollinate their crops. If a farmer had to pollinate all of his own plants, it would take an enormous amount of time. So farmers are incredibly grateful for the help that bees give them on their farms. But animals and birds also really rely on bees to pollinate plants, because in pollinating some of the crops, animals need to eat. They're helping keep animals alive. And then, of course, if we're not vegetarians, we rely on those animals as a source of our healthy nutrition as well. And birds most certainly rely on seeds that come from plants that also need to be pollinated so that they have something to eat. And you begin to see this great big chain of life that all kind of comes back to bees. So you may have heard scientists and environmentalists chanting, "Save the bees!" And you've wondered perhaps, what's wrong with the bees? Why are they in such trouble? Well, unfortunately, the population of bees is decreasing. It's decreasing here in Ireland, but it's decreasing all around the world. And there are a few reasons for that. So part of the problem that's leading to a decrease in the bee population is the fact that our climate is changing. Bees rely really heavily on clear, distinct seasons, going from spring to summer, autumn, and winter. And their life cycle depends upon a clear cycle like that. When we start to have temperature changes that alter our climate and change the pattern of the seasons that the bees are so used to, it can throw them off and cause problems to happen. If, for example, we have a very mild winter and the temperatures begin to rise, bees might begin to think, spring is here, and come out of hibernation and start laying eggs. But perhaps that rise in temperature is only a short stint. It's not actually spring. And in coming out of hibernation too early, bees can find themselves in a bit of trouble. Like if the temperatures suddenly drop and it's just too cold for them to be outside, or from an inability to find the food that they need because it's too early in the season for them to find the weeds and flowers that they need for food sources. Bees also find it really hard to get through very intense storms. So climate change is increasing the number of large storms with heavy rain and high winds that threaten the lives of bees when they're out flying in our gardens. So the use of chemical sprays on crops or even in our own gardens in order to kill weeds is also really harming the bee population. It's eliminating their food source in huge numbers, and that's leading the bee population to decline. Which leads us to think about the things that we can do in order to help the bee population. And there are many. There are really big things that we might need lots of other people to help us out with. But there are also very small things that we can do in order to play a part in helping maintain a healthy bee population. And perhaps this might be a nice time for your teacher to press pause and reflect or brainstorm on some of the things that you think you might be able to do in order to help the bees. So, did you come up with a list of things that we might be able to do in order to help bees? Let's think about some of them. Certainly we could reduce the amount of chemicals that we use in our own gardens. So asking our moms and dads and other grown-ups not to spray weeds. If they really want to remove weeds, you could do it by hand instead of using harmful chemicals. But we could also encourage the grown-ups in our lives or ourselves, if we help with the gardening, to just leave the weeds there, to learn to live with weeds because they provide a really good food source for the bees. The other thing that we could do is add plants to our gardens that provide bees with lots of nectar or the type of food that the bees need. So there's a huge list of flowers that bees can get nectar from, and if we introduce these plants, either lots of them or just a few, we'll be making a difference to ensuring that bees have plenty of food to eat. And some of the flowers that you could think about planting in your garden are things like sunflowers or lavender, wallflowers or daisies. Bees can get lots of nectar from all of these plants. Perhaps you might like to visit a garden center with a grown-up sometimes. Very often you will see that flowers are marked bee-friendly, or they have a little bee on the label, which is a great sign to show us which plants bees will love. And by filling up our garden with those plants, we're providing a wonderful food source. But bees need more than just food in order to have a healthy life. They also need places to live, or habitats. And some of the spaces that bees love most are where tall grass grows. It provides shelter for the bees so that when the weather does get windy, they won't be blown about. And one of the things that we can do in our own back gardens is to leave areas of the lawn uncut. So instead of using your lawnmower to keep all of the grass short, you might decide to leave one area, maybe at the back of your garden or in the corner of the garden, where the grass grows a little bit longer to provide a lovely habitat for bees. Another place where bees really love to live is by burrowing into dirt banks. So if there's a portion of your garden where the sun shines for a big part of the day, you might think about clearing away some of the grass to expose the bare soil, because bees will use that to burrow in and make tiny little holes or tunnels. And it would be a wonderful place for them to build a home in your own garden. They can build that themselves. They also love sand and can burrow into sand, so small little sand piles somewhere in your garden would be a wonderful way to add a good bee habitat. But there are also things that you can build. We're going to be building a bee hotel out of recyclables and natural materials in just a little while. But a very simple way that you could make a house for a bee is to take a block of wood and drill holes into it with an electric drill. Of course, you'd need the help of a grown-up in order to do this. But a block of wood with lots of little holes is another wonderful bee house that you could make together with a grown-up and add to your garden. There are 3 different types of bees here in Ireland, and they have different types of homes that they're interested in living in. The first type is the honeybee, and honeybees are really very happy living in hives that people make for them. They live together in colonies with lots of other bees. Then there's bumblebees, and bumblebees like to live in nests that they build themselves. Last but not least, there are solitary bees. Solitary bees don't live in big groups. As you can probably guess from their name, they live alone, and they like to burrow into very small spaces for their nest. So a bee hotel that has lots of very small spaces that a solitary bee can climb into is an absolutely ideal habitat. And I am going to show you just what you need to do in order to build your very own bee hotel for the solitary bees that might live in your back garden. Let's get started. So in order to build a bee hotel out of recyclables and natural materials, we need 5 different things. We need a tin can, which we can get out of the recycling bin, but we're going to want to make sure that we safely remove the lid so that it doesn't have a sharp edge, which could hurt our fingers, and we want to make sure that it's clean. So a clean tin can from the recycling bin with a safe edge around that's not too sharp is the first material. Next, we're going to need a piece of cardboard. So any kind of clean, dry cardboard, again, out of your recycling bin would be perfect. Next, we're going to need some paper, and I'm using newspaper, again, from my recycling bin, but any kind of clean, dry paper will do. So if you have some old note paper or pages from a book that you are no longer using or a magazine, you could cut them out. You just want to make sure that they're dry. And finally, some twigs or sticks. Now, I've got really little ones here. You might be able to find a big stick or a big twig that you can break down into smaller pieces. But we don't want them to be too big, so we'll go foraging around in the garden to find some small little twigs like that. We're also going to need some string. Mine is wool or a bit of yarn, but any kind of simple string will do. And finally, a pair of scissors that you can use to put your hotel together. And with these very simple items, either from the recycling bin or found in our own back garden, we can build a perfect little home for a bee. When it's done, it's going to look like this. What we're going to do is use the cardboard and the paper and the twigs and sticks and pack them very, very tightly inside our tin can, creating lots of wonderful tiny spaces that solitary bees will just love to move into. And I'll show you how we're going to do that right now. So as I said, we want our tin can to be clean and we want to make sure that it doesn't have a sharp edge. My tin can used to have tin tomatoes in it, and it had the type of top that pulls open. That's an ideal type of tin can to use for this because it means that it's not sharp. So just be sure to have a grown-up check that that tin can is not too sharp. And once it's clean and dried out, it's ready to go. And the next step is going to be to add the cardboard to our tin can. My tin can isn't very big, but you remember how I said that solitary bees like really small spaces in which to nest? This does not count as a very small space. So what we want to do, and what I've done in my finished one here, is divide up this one big opening into several different spaces within our tin can. And we're going to do that by using the cardboard. So I have a rectangular piece of cardboard, which I took off of a box that came in the post. And what I'm going to need to do is use my scissors in order to cut my cardboard so that it's no taller than my tin can. So I'm going to line my cardboard up against my tin can, and I'm going to note how high it's going to be. I'm just going to hold my finger there to show me exactly where I want to cut all along my cardboard in order to make sure that it's going to fit inside my tin can. So I'm going to use my scissors to cut a straight line the whole way across so that it is no taller than my tin can. And there's a really important reason for doing this. When we put all of the different materials into our tin can to make our bee hotel, we want to make sure that they all fit tightly inside. This one has a wee bit of a twig popping out, but the cardboard and the paper rolls all fit snugly inside so that when I put my bee hotel outside, and it inevitably begins to rain, because we know we get a lot of rain in Ireland, the paper and the cardboard won't get wet and turn all soggy, because that would definitely put a bee off staying in my hotel. We want to make sure that everything fits inside so that it's sheltered from the rain, and the tin can itself provides the canopy that keeps everything inside dry. So once your cardboard has been cut down so that it's no bigger than your can, you can begin to fold it. And you don't have to be too specific. I'm going to fold it down one way and then back on itself another, an accordion fold, going back and forth and back and forth. But as you can see, I'm not measuring. I'm not trying to make sure that every fold is exactly the same size. I'm just trying to take one long straight piece of cardboard and make it into several different shorter pieces, or little letter V's like this, side by side. Because when I do that, and I place my cardboard inside my can, and manipulate it around or move it around a little bit, you can see that what I've achieved is I have changed one big opening into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different openings, almost like corridors or floors in a hotel. And it means that the space is much, much smaller and will be easier to fill with my paper rolls and twigs. I am going to encourage your teacher to press pause here for just a minute while you complete the cardboard step of this project. And while you're doing that, I have a question for you that you might like to talk about while you're cutting and folding and placing your cardboard inside your tin. And my question is, how many different species of bee do you think live in Ireland? I mentioned that there's 3 types, the honeybee, the bumblebee, and the solitary bee. But how many species do you think there are altogether? While you're working on the cardboard, your teacher presses pause, have a brainstorm and a bit of a guessing game, and we'll see who comes the closest. All right, has everyone packed their piece of cardboard inside their tin can? It should look something like this now. And did you make a guess of how many species of bees there are in Ireland? Let's see who was the closest. The answer is 99. 99 different species of bees. But you know what the really interesting part is? Out of all 99 species of bees, only one of them is a honeybee. Fascinating, right? There is one species of honeybee in the whole of Ireland. There are 21 different species of bumblebees, and that leaves a whopping 77 different species of solitary bees, which means that the vast majority of bees that we have here in Ireland are actually solitary bees. So it's a good thing that we're making a home for them to live in. So if you've completed the cardboard step of your bee hotel, your tin can should look like this. And next comes the packing in of paper rolls. Those paper rolls are going to be like the hotel rooms. They're the tiny little spaces that solitary bees will love so much. And in order to make them, we are going to take a piece of paper, like a piece of newspaper, and we're going to roll it. So what I have done is taken a huge big sheet of newspaper, and just like the cardboard, I've held it up to my tin can. You can do this down flat on a table as well. But I've held it up to my tin can in order to make sure that the width of my paper is no higher, or the height of my paper, I should say, is no higher than my tin can. Because just like my cardboard, I want to make sure that my paper stays inside as well. So I've measured with my tin can to find out just how tall I want this piece of paper to be, and then I've used my scissors to cut the whole way across the newspaper so that I've ended up with this huge, big, long strip. Now, if you're using a regular size piece of paper, like this, regular white A4 paper, again, you can hold it up to your tin can and mark the place where you want to cut and cut it into a big, long strip. And a strip of paper that is the size of an A4 will work just as well as a great big long roll of newspaper. Either one work just fine. And once you have your rectangular piece of paper that is the same height as your can, all you need to do is roll it up. So I am going to do that with my big piece of paper. I'm going to start at the top and I'm going to begin to roll it. I can do that by rolling it down my body. But I have another really good trick. So if you find rolling paper by hand tricky, and I don't blame you because I do as well, here's my really good trick. If you take a pencil and wrap the paper around the pencil, you can then roll it up really tight, much, much easier. And the great thing about a pencil is that because it's very small, it's going to give you a really perfectly sized roll. As the space that will be left inside when we pull the pencil out is going to be a perfectly ideal size for a solitary bee. They will just love this hotel room and climb right in and make themselves at home. So by rolling, mine was such a big strip of paper that it's taking me a while. Rolling, we come to the end of our strip of paper and it's all very tightly around my pencil. Now the only trick is to hold it at one end while we pull the pencil out. Ta-da! And we've got a tightly wrapped roll of newspaper that is absolutely perfect for a bee. What we want to do with this roll then is place it inside our can. Now, the trouble with a roll of paper is that the minute I let go, it's going to kind of uncurl or unfurl. And my nice, tight, tiny space that my bees will love so much will grow a little bit better. So there's a trick to this part of our bee hotel. And it has to do with our sticks. We've subdivided the can with the cardboard so that we've created some small spaces. And what we're going to be doing is making many rolls of paper that we can put in to fill up all of those spaces. But when you do that with each roll of paper, my suggestion is to have your twigs and sticks ready so that you can slide one in right beside the roll in order to help keep it from unfurling. So when you go to all the trouble of tightly rolling up a piece of paper in order to be a nice small circle, you don't want to lose that small circle when you let go. If you place in a piece of paper and then press a stick in right beside it, it can help hold it closed. But you know what? If you roll up a piece of paper and it begins to unfurl a bit, like this one did on me, don't panic. By holding either end of your paper like this, you can pull a bit on one side to tighten it up again and get your roll back. It's not the end of the world if it does uncurl a bit. You can just start again. But what we're going to do is take many, many lengths of paper to make many rolls. For one tin can, I'm thinking that somewhere between 8 to 10 rolls of paper would be absolutely ideal, which means that you need to cut between 8 and 10 long lengths of paper, no taller than your tin, and then roll them all up so that you have several rolls to work with. That's going to take you a little bit of time, so your teacher might want to press pause again here. And while you're working on making many rolls of paper, I've got another thing for you to brainstorm. I named a few flowers that have nectar that bees love to eat. I think I mentioned daisies, lavender, and sunflowers. But can you name some more flowers that bees really love to eat? Or to eat from, to eat the nectar from? I wonder if you could maybe come up with a big, long list of plants and flowers that bees enjoy. And perhaps you can think of them by thinking about the bees that you've seen in your own back garden or in gardens somewhere else that have attracted bees. Like, for example, an apple tree. I have a huge one outside my house and it's full of apples right now, and the air is alive with the buzzing of bees who are feeding on some of the apples that have fallen around the bottom of the tree. So while you're making your rolls of paper, have a little think and a brainstorm and see how large a list of plants and flowers you can come up with that bees rely on as a source of food. So, hopefully you've created lots of rolls of paper and your bee hotel is beginning to fill up with lots and lots of hotel rooms and twigs and sticks. I have about 3 in there so far. And I'm also hoping that you came up with a huge big long list of the kinds of flowers that bees love to find nectar in. So I have a few more here. There's also wallflowers, dandelions, rosemary, which is a wonderful herb for cooking, crab apples and apple trees like I mentioned, but also hyacinths, which are beautiful short little flowers that grow in the spring, and a really good one in winter time, the crocus. That's a wonderful flower that bees like to feed from. Hopefully you've come up with a big, big long list together with your classmates and your teacher. And those are some of the flowers that you could ask grown-ups to plant in their gardens in order to provide a great food source for the bees. So I sort of already showed you what we're going to do with our twigs, which is to help pack in really tightly to fill all the spaces inside our bee hotel. But just a note of mention about your twigs and sticks. Mine have already been cut short, and you have probably guessed they are the same height as my tin, right? So it all fits inside very snugly. But if you have a really long branch, hopefully you're able to snap it in order to make the twigs smaller. If your twigs have been lying around for a while, it means that they haven't been on a tree for a long time, and they'll be quite dry, which makes them easy to snap. But if your branch has or twig has just recently fallen off a tree, the wood inside might still be quite wet, which means that it's not so easy to snap, and you might need to cut it. And I would suggest that you get the help of a grown-up, because using scissors to cut twigs can sometimes result in us hurting our hands. So the easiest thing would be to get really small twigs that you can snap yourself, or ask a grown-up to help. But the aim of the game is to have several twigs and sticks that are no taller than our can, that we can use to place inside all of these little corridors or floors in our hotel, in order to pack the spaces really tightly. Because what we want to achieve when our bee hotel is complete, and this is almost the last step, is that all of the spaces are so tightly packed that when we tip our tin can upside down, nothing falls out. So please don't do this with a practically half full can and have everything fall out on you. That would be a disaster. But when you think you've got it nearly packed tight, you could give it a little test to see, is everything falling out? Or are all of the parts of your bee hotel so tightly packed that they're staying inside? That is the aim of the game. To have about 8 or 10 tightly wrapped rolls of paper like these, and lots of twigs packed inside really tightly to totally fill up the tin can. And that is going to complete the construction of the hotel. The last thing we need to do then is tie a string to our can so that you can hang it in your garden. So in order to do that, you just need a long piece of string. And what I did for mine was to tie a string in 2 parts, at one end of the can and the other end of my can. So I'm going to wrap my string around my can and then tie a knot. There's one. I'm going to do the same around the bottom. So there's one string at the top of the can, one string at the bottom of the can, and I've left the length of string hanging off of them a little bit long so that for the last step I can tie it. While you're tying the string around your can in order to make a holder for your, or a hanger for your bee hotel, I've got one last idea that you can brainstorm with your class. And that is to come up with a list of all of the different things that you could do, either in your own back garden or in your schoolyard, in order to help the bees. It could be a Save the Bees to-do list. So while you're working on tying your strings, your teacher can press pause and you might come up with a list of ideas of ways that you can all help the bees. So that's it. If you've finished tying your string around, then your bee hotel is ready to hang into a tree. And I hope that you've come up with a really big list of things that you can do around your own garden or in your school garden in order to help the bees. Things like leaving areas where the grass is growing taller and not being cut, planting flowers that provide nectar for bees to give them a source of food, maybe making a promise not to use chemical sprays or weed killers, and maybe letting those weeds grow, particularly dandelions. They grow for a very short time in the year, and I know that they don't always look great in a lovely green lawn, but if we could leave some of them, we'd be providing a really good source of food for the bees. So perhaps you could make a promise to do that. And then, of course, helping to build habitats. Either more bee hotels like this, if you had fun making one, you could make several of them. You just need to gather the materials together from your recycling box, and you could have lots of bee hotels all around your back garden. But you could also make one by drilling holes into a block of wood with the help of a grown-up, or by exposing some bare soil for solitary bees to burrow into. And like we said, leaving some grass to grow for the kinds of bumblebees that like growing in nesting in tall grass areas. So lots of different things that you can do to help the bees. And one more really interesting, important thing that you can do to help the bees would be to talk about bees with others. You've just learned all sorts of amazing facts about bees with me today. You're becoming bee experts. So you can share that knowledge and all of the things you've just learned by talking about bees with others. Then maybe they might make some changes in their own back gardens in order to help the bees as well. Because the more of us who are playing our part to help the bees, the better off the bees will be. My suggestion would be that when you put your bee hotel outside, you think of two things. One, bees don't like rain. They don't like to get wet. So we've made sure that we packed all of the materials tightly inside the tin can so that it acts as a rain cover. That also means that when you place it into your garden, you don't want to position it pointing upwards. You want to make sure that it's fully on its side, or maybe even tilting downwards a wee bit so that the rain runs off and doesn't end up going into your can. So think about that when you choose a spot for your hotel. The other thing I would suggest is not to put it right against the ground, because if we have a big rainfall and it's on the ground, some of the rain might come into the bottom of the can and get your cardboard and paper rolls all wet and soggy. So raise it up a little bit, maybe on some rocks or another piece of wood or on top of a flower pot or something, so it's not right on the ground. And if you want to use the string to hang it into a tree, my last bit of advice is bees don't like the wind. They wouldn't like a bee hotel that gets blown about in stormy weather. So if you want to place it on the branch of a tree, I would suggest putting it onto a branch that can also lean against another part of the tree that gives it a bit of stability. Now I'm going to bring my bee hotel out into my garden and take a picture of the place where I have placed it to give you an idea of just how you can hang it into the tree. So when it comes to placing your bee hotel in your garden, you don't have to use the string if you don't want to. This is a spot in my own back garden just underneath an enormous apple tree where lots of bees are gathering anyway. So rather than hang it in the tree, I decided to rest it on this column in my orchard wall, and I've angled it ever so slightly so that the rain will run off the top, but I've just rested it in amongst some branches. It's not going to blow around and it shouldn't get too wet, plus the bees are already close by, so hopefully they'll be able to find it quite easily. If you do want to hang your bee hotel in a tree, then just make sure that you place it really snugly, either up against the trunk of a tree or leaning against some branches like I've done here. That's going to make sure that your bee hotel doesn't get blown about in any storms and it can't fall out of the tree. And again, I have it hanging nice and straight so that none of the water can get into my bee hotel. If there's one more thing that you would like to do to help the bee population here in Ireland, that's to help scientists track it. And you can do that very easily by observing the number of bees in your own back garden. Helping scientists to gather information is called being a citizen scientist. And anyone can do it. Moms and dads, kids, grown-ups, anybody at all. There's a really wonderful website called the National Biodiversity Database, and it's a central place where scientists working to study and research the bee population here in Ireland keep track of and record the number of bees in different parts of the country. If it's something that you think you would like to do, being a citizen scientist and helping to collect data, you can visit their website and find out more to learn how to be a citizen scientist and do a bee count in your own back garden. By sharing that information, you help scientists to get a better understanding of just how healthy the bee population is in Ireland on a whole and in certain parts of the country. So it's a really simple, easy thing that you can do. Doesn't take very long. All it needs is your eyes to observe and your brain to record the data, and then share it with some scientists who will be very grateful to have that bit of research knowledge from you in your own part of the country. So I hope that you've had a good time building this bee hotel. I'm really glad that I was able to share this workshop with you. I would love to see some of the bee hotels that you've made. So perhaps your teacher could take a picture of your class bee hotels and share them with Barbaro. That would be wonderful to see all of the bee hotels that are being made all around Galway and elsewhere in the country. I want to say thank you so much to Barbaro for including me in their school program this year, and happy bee hotel building. Take care. Bye-bye.